Traci, it is so great to have you on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Davey, thank you for having me. I really enjoy the Nothing is Wasted podcast and just really honored to be here.
Well, it is likewise an honor. I've been reading a little bit of your story, and I'm just really glad that we get to have this conversation because I know firsthand so many of our listeners, so many of our community are walking through a painful journey with infertility, with miscarriage, and it's one of those things that I think needs to be talked about a lot more. And obviously, I feel a little bit, I feel unqualified to talk about it. And so, as many times as I can get someone like yourself who's walked this journey to come and encourage our listeners, I'm really excited of the healing and the perspective that they're going to receive and glean from it. So, thank you again for spending this time with us. I'd love for our listeners just to hear a little bit about you and, just kind of modern day Traci McCombs, like where do you live? What is your family like right now? And then we'll jump back and we'll talk a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, so I currently live in Stuttgart, Germany. My husband's an active duty Army officer, and I know things are pretty crazy in the world right now, but we are due to PCS to Texas soon. We've lived around the world. We've lived in Hawaii, Washington, D.C., North Carolina, and just really enjoy being a part of the military. It's a very special community full of some really amazing people. And I currently work for the National Institutes of Health, which, I bet 2 years ago a lot of people didn't know what the NIH was, but I bet with COVID and other things that have been
Right.
going on, people now know what the NIH is. And I've been working for the NIH for almost 9 years now. So, yeah, those are two pretty important parts of my life right now.
Wow. Wow. Well, you're over in Germany, and so obviously there's so much involved in your story, not just kind of personally what you guys have walked through, but also being in a different scenario or a different setting in your community, and being away from probably what was your home. I'm assuming the United States was your home prior to this stint over in Germany, and so I know that we're going to talk a little bit about that as we come to it, because I know there's so many people who are also in these spaces where they feel maybe isolated or lacking community, and so I'd love for you to speak to that. But why don't you go back and talk to us a little bit just about the beginning of what you would call the beginning of your journey, and just kind of story with us a little bit, share what this journey's been like for you.
Sure. So I think it'll be best for me to kind of break my story up into 7 different thoughts that I had along my journey and how those thoughts sometimes, ended up becoming epiphanies, or sometimes I realized later that maybe the thoughts weren't accurate thoughts.
Mm.
Um, but the first thought that I thought, when my husband and I decided to start trying to have a family was, this is going to be easy. Like, this is going to be
Mm.
so great. And I think a lot of women assume that, right? When you're young and you maybe just got married, and you're still in that honeymoon phase of marriage and everything, you can't help but think that everything is just going to work out great. And so that's the mentality that I had going into trying to start a family. And I just thought it was going to be like a super easy experience for me. The first time that I actually had pause about that thought was when my best friend had a miscarriage. That was my first experience with infertility or loss, was witnessing it happening to somebody else. We were at a Christian function and we were volunteering. It was called Christmas in July. I think we were watching Christmas movies in July, and we were volunteering at the concession stand and doing all the candies. And that earlier that morning, my friend had texted me that her doctor gave her the unfortunate news that, you know, the the baby growing inside her didn't have a heartbeat. And I know she was devastated, and she said, I can't go home. I want to just get it off of my mind and distract myself with something. I need to be around friends just so I can forget it for a while. And so I invited her to the event. I said, please come volunteer with me. We'll have a great time. We'll just do our best to, kind of not worry about this right now. And while we were at the event, um, neither one of us realized that there was the the possibility that the actual miscarriage could start.
Mm.
And that is what happened during this event. My friend um, literally experienced her miscarriage at the event, and I was next to her when things started to happen. I'll never forget the face that the eyes that she gave me, and just the trauma that she was going through and experiencing. And I felt so inadequate as a friend because I did not know how to support her. I didn't really know what was even going on. I had just started trying to get pregnant myself. I wasn't a nurse. I had no medical experience. And so, I immediately called her husband and said, you have to come pick her up. We don't know what's going on. And the thing that I remember from that day more than anything was helping her out to the car and just the grandmother like steps that she had to take just to make sure nothing happened. And when we finally got outside and her husband was there to help her in the car, she just gave me this hug of desperation. And I will never forget what she said to me. She said, I am so sorry. I should never have come. And that really resonated with me. And at the time, it didn't register, but having lived through my own miscarriages, looking back, I just find it so amazing that a woman going through something like that, the thing that is on her mind is to apologize.
Wow.
And I think so many women end up thinking it's their fault
Mm.
or placing blame on themselves when it is absolutely not their fault. And we just kind of have like this natural instinct to be like, oh my gosh, what did I do?
Mm.
Or, what could I have done differently to change the outcome? And so I wanted to start with that because, all women kind of walk into this experience thinking, this is going to be great. Like, this is going to be amazing. But that is not the case for all women. Like, 1 in 4 women will experience a miscarriage.
Mm.
1 in 8 women will experience infertility. So if you've got a group of girlfriends and you're all out at lunch, take a look around the table because one of them is going to experience this. And, I just, wanted to start with that because
Yeah.
that kind of really gave me pause. Like, okay, like this might not be as fun and exciting as I thought it might be. Maybe I need to be a little bit more cautious.
Mm.
And then the second thought that I'd like to share with everybody on the podcast today is that while this happened to my friend, I never thought it would happen to me.
Mm.
And I think every woman that hears about infertility or hears about stillbirths or hears about ectopic pregnancies or anything, it's always another woman, but it's never going to be me. And
Yes.
that's really, I think, mm, that lie, and I shouldn't call it a lie, but just that thought that I had in my head, kind of keeping me
Mm.
going. Like I'm still going to try to get pregnant here because I really don't believe anything's going to go wrong.
Mm.
Um, and then a few months later, I experienced my own miscarriage. My husband and I were on the base, and we were doing that initial um, appointment where you go in and you check the heartbeat and they monitor you, and
Mm.
it's supposed to be like a really great
Right.
appointment. You get this really great book that tells you about pregnancy and all the different fruit sizes that your baby's going to grow
Mm.
into, and they ask questions and make sure if you have any concerns that they're addressed. And the anticipation, for 8 weeks is really just, I want to see the baby.
Right.
Like I want to um, have the ultrasound and see the little peanut on the screen, and we can all celebrate, and it's going to be amazing, right? And so I'm sure for most women who experience a miscarriage, it's almost like you can remember every detail about that moment.
Mm.
I can remember the ugly peach color of the curtains that were drawn
Mm.
in the doctor's office. I can remember the sanitizer smell. I can remember my doctor's voice like it was yesterday. And that moment when a doctor's face goes from a smile to kind of just this concerning look,
Yeah.
to silence. And then you're just kind of like, what's going on? And when they finally say, it doesn't look good, I'm sorry, there's not a heartbeat, that's when
Yeah.
the thought that this could never happen to me just like crumbles into a million pieces. So in that moment, I had my black Toms on. I had, my jeans and everything. I remember everything I was wearing. My doctor was really thoughtful, and she said, I'm going to step out for about 10 minutes and give you and your husband some time, and then I'm going to come back and we'll talk about next steps. And that gave me time to just mourn with my husband, um, mourn so much. And it's not just mourning, it's a different kind of mourning. And I think the mourning is you're mourning the hope that you had and all of the dreams that you had for this thing growing inside of you that it doesn't exist anymore. And you also mourn all of the work that you put into it to get there. My husband and I didn't get pregnant on our first time. It took us 8 months. And for most women, that's pretty average amount of time it takes to, actually get pregnant. And so it was like, wow, we've been trying 8 months, and not only are we not pregnant, like we're worse off than not pregnant. Like we have this like new heartbreak that we're going to be carrying around. And so, yeah, miscarriages are tough,
Yeah.
and they're just different. They're unexplainable, really. The pain, because something that I thought about after my miscarriage is, only women have like the amazing opportunity to carry life inside of them and birth that life into existence. Like, what an amazing gift that God gives us to do that. And when that's taken away and you feel so crushed, I don't think there's anything in the world that can explain what that feeling's like. And so that's the second thought I had, was that this would never happen to me. And then, walking out of the doctor's office that day, I was like, how did this happen to
Yeah.
me?
Yeah.
So,
Oh my goodness.
yeah.
I
And
think
then
one of the things.
a third key.
Oh,
Oh, go ahead. Go
well,
ahead.
I was gonna, if I could interject right there. I think you hit the nail on the head, Traci. When it comes to this, the unique nature of a miscarriage and the unique aspect of grief is that you have this season where you are, man, it's this exciting time, right? You and your spouse, you're pregnant, and you've got these dreams and these hopes and these plans and this, and you're beginning to create this life before it's created, and for all intents and purposes, you're already living that life. In your mind, you're like, okay, we're going here, we're doing this, we're making these plans, this is what this baby's gonna be like, and you're hoping and dreaming, and you're reading books on names, or you're doing all these different things. And so it's this immediate, it's like this rise and this crescendo of hope, and then an immediate disappointment, and even, I mean, far worse than disappointment, this just excruciating, gut-wrenching grief that happens almost immediately right there. And I think that's one of the unique things. Elizabeth Elliot talks about how suffering is having what you don't want or wanting what you don't have. Two different forms of suffering that we walk through. And so, before we kind of go to the next thought that you had right there, can you talk about, a little bit, what it's like as you're wrestling through that type of suffering, where you're experiencing the epitome of hope and despair, like all within a moment. I mean, this is the,
Yeah.
like you said, this is the moment where you're going to hear the heartbeat. This is an exciting moment, and you were not expecting the result that you guys walked out of there with.
Yeah. Yeah. It was just it's really difficult to explain how that moment was. When we went out of the hospital, you know, you hear about people who say they're kind of in autopilot.
Yeah, maybe
You
like
know,
a
they're just kind
fog
of
or
going
something.
through.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what it was. It was just a fog. It
Mm.
really was a fog. And I remember on the way home, uh, my husband was holding my hand and didn't say anything. But then I turned to my husband, and just in a moment of truth, just because of all this stuff had happened, I turned to him and I said, Adam, like, I think I hate my dad. And I know listeners are probably like, whoa, like,
Mm.
what is she talking about? Like, she's talking about she hates her dad here. And that's kind of the third thought I kind of want to talk
Mm.
to the listeners about. And that third thought that I had was that I could compartmentalize my issues,
Mm.
and that I could box everything separately and handle it. And I think when people start experiencing infertility and miscarriage, a lot of people don't realize that other uninvited events that are happening in life don't cease to exist.
Yeah.
And there can easily become this pile of grief
Yeah.
or this pile of other stuff that just kind of gets exacerbated,
Mm.
right, when you're going through this. And that's what happened to me. Um, when I was growing up, my dad struggled with alcohol,
Mm.
and he had a very serious problem with alcohol, and he was a very high functioning alcoholic. So as a kid, I didn't recognize that. And there was no abuse. I mean, my dad was a great dad for a very long time to me. And so that was a challenge for me. I think my dad's alcoholism was this boiling up of anger towards my dad
Mm.
over a lot of years. And then, at that time, about a week before I realized that I was pregnant, my dad left my mother. He just left. There was a lot of infertility between on my dad's. My dad had a lot of infertility. Like he cheated on my mom quite often. Things that we found out later as well. And so, a week before I found out I was even pregnant, I lost my dad. I had no idea where he was,
Jeez.
what he was doing. So that abandonment
Yeah.
feeling, came back. And then my brother had lost his job during this time. So I was
Oh
worried about
man.
my brother. And then I was worried about my mom and how she was coping with just this very dysfunctional marriage, and what would soon be the end to her marriage of 30 years. And
Mm.
so I thought I could compartmentalize all this stuff and deal with it. But it was almost like the infertility and the miscarriage kind of was the breaking point for
Yeah.
me. And I realized I couldn't compartmentalize these things. And that just because I was experiencing a miscarriage didn't mean the rest of the world stopped turning.
Yeah.
And that was really challenging for me. Really, really challenging for me. So
Mm.
I was trying to work through a lot of that. I was trying to find healing after my miscarriage to kind of understand why that was happening. I was trying to, just kind of honestly suppress my feelings about my father. And I was like, just trying to move on. And, for a couple months, Adam and I, found some really nice activities. I was reading scripture about infertility in the Bible, like Hannah. I was reading more about her story
Mm.
and Sarah, and just trying to get a biblical perspective on infertility,
Yeah.
which there is a lot of infertility in the Bible.
Right.
And then, finally got to a point where I felt like, okay, I think I'm going to be okay because research says only 1 in 100 women have back-to-back miscarriages.
Mm.
That's definitely not happening to me.
Mm.
And so that's the fourth key thought that I had through my journey was, okay, I never thought it could happen to me, but I'm like absolutely certain this will never happen again because there's no way I'm the 1 in 100 women
Mm.
that this will happen to.
Wow.
Um, if you remember my friend at the beginning of our talk, the one who had the miscarriage at church,
Mm-hmm.
Well, she was pregnant and she was just a few months away from having her baby, and she asked me to host her baby shower. And at this point, I knew I was pregnant for the second time. I was for sure I would not have a second miscarriage. My friend was about to have her rainbow baby, and it was just it was a good time.
Yeah.
And I just remember being at that baby shower, loving just being in a community of women who were excited for my friend,
Mm.
um, being excited about my own pregnancy, being around women, being able to talk about babies and not feel like an outsider
Mm-hmm.
and not feel like I was outside of this fun circle that everyone wanted to be a part of. And I finally felt like, okay, my bad season's over. I'm over the hump now. I get to, be a part of this really amazing group that all women who want to have
Right.
babies want to be a part
Right.
of. And the next day, literally the day after my best friend's baby shower, I woke up and there was blood.
Mm.
And for the second time, in less than a year's time, I knew
Mm.
in that moment I knew that I had lost my second baby. And my husband was very great. He was very gentle with me and was like, "Let's not draw conclusions. We need to go to the emergency room. We need to make sure that this isn't something else. Let's not lose hope here." But just I think women have like this sixth sense about certain things,
Mm.
and
Mm.
I just felt like my body knew and like my heart knew that the baby was gone, and so it was quite a dreadful um, ride to the emergency room because it was a Sunday. And I was supposed to be in Sunday school with all my girlfriends talking about how amazing my best friend's baby shower was. I was supposed to be, thinking about my own baby shower and what I wanted to do with it and having people celebrate me too.
Yeah.
And instead, I was in an emergency room with a woman asking me to jot down what my emergency was. And like, how do you even jot down on a piece of paper what your emergency is? Like, I think I've had a miscarriage.
Mm.
And so that was a very difficult day too. And some women, experience miscarriage, outside of their traditional doctor setting. Like, my first miscarriage, I was already at the doctor. So I already
Mm.
had the support I needed to know what to do.
Right.
This second time I was at home. And so, going to a doctor I didn't know, going to an ER nurse that I didn't know, it was a very different experience the second time. And I remember they had to verify that it was a miscarriage. So they had to do an ultrasound, and they wouldn't let me look at the machine. They wouldn't let me look at the monitor or anything. And because it was a Sunday, half of the hospital was like not lit, like the lights were off. And I just remember it being like just this really, really dark hallway and being wheeled down this wheelchair in this super dark hallway thinking, what am I doing here? Like, what's going on? Like, this can't be happening to me. And, the ultrasound tech took forever. And yeah, by the time I got wheeled back to my room, the ER doctor confirmed that I had had my second miscarriage, and
Mm.
the second miscarriage was different than the first. I think the first miscarriage was just grief,
Yeah.
like lots and lots of grief and sadness. The second miscarriage was a little bit different in that there was fear,
Mm.
there was anger.
Yeah.
I think there was a little bit of bitterness and jealousy, and all of these other types of emotions that I never expected to be experiencing kind of started surfing, coming to the surface. And yeah, that
Wow.
was really tough. So after that second miscarriage, we started doing testing. And, our my OBGYN was like, most people don't start doing testing until they've had three miscarriages. And I remember looking at her in the eye and I was like, we are not waiting for three miscarriages.
Mm.
It's not going to happen. We're doing testing now. Um, we also had to consider a potential deployment that my husband was about to go
Wow.
on. And that instilled a lot of fear in me too. If he was going to deploy, it could be an entire year before we'd even get to try again. So we did a lot of testing, and the test came back that I have a rare chromosome disorder called balanced Robertsonian translocation,
Hmm.
which makes me much more higher risk for pregnancy loss and much more higher risk for having a baby with severe developmental issues like trisomy. And they also discovered a blood clotting disorder, which also can complicate pregnancy. And so, all this stuff's kind of getting thrown
Oh,
on
goodness.
me. It's not only did I have two miscarriages, but my body is broken.
Mm,
Like, you know, I'm supposed to be fruitful and multiply, and it is
mm,
not happening. And I just felt like I wasn't good enough for my husband.
mm.
That was an insecurity for me. Like my body was ruining our chances at expanding our family. So all of those thoughts, all of those things just kind of started to pile on. And I was really close to a breaking point,
Mm.
to be honest, after that second miscarriage. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. You say you were close to a breaking
Um,
point. Did you what kind of tipped you over one way or the other? I mean, did you hit a breaking point, or was there some kind of, I don't know, some kind of real cathartic experience that began to turn some things for you and your perspective in that? I think particularly what one of the things I'm asking in that is, you said as the second miscarriage was different than the first, and that you started feeling these emotions that you'd never felt before. Fear and anger and jealousy, and we talk often that these emotions are very real emotions, and you're not a
yeah.
bad person because you experience these emotions, even though they're undesirable emotions, right? You get surprised by those emotions
Right.
as well. But there's a difference between letting those kind of, you hit a breaking point and those overtake you, or you hit a breaking point and those you begin to figure out um, how to turn those around. How would you describe kind of
Yeah.
that moment for you? And maybe it comes a little bit later in the storyline, but as we're right here, I'm wondering, how did
Yeah.
you not just experience those emotions, but begin to go, wait, how do I live with these and combat these in a healthy way?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the next part of my story is actually my breaking point.
Mm,
So, the fifth thought that I had on this journey that I went through with infertility was that I can't be mad at God. And that was kind of
you
like
thought it was
that
taboo
thought
to be
that I
mad at
took
God.
from, yes.
Okay.
Yes. I thought, from my childhood,
Mm,
you just don't be mad at God. You
mm,
just always be thankful. Never, disturb the peace between you and
yeah.
him in your prayer. And I always
Right.
just kind of took this very formal approach with
Mm.
my talks with God. And
In some ways, it's almost
I
like a
will give you
karma
an
approach, right, Tracy? You're like, as long as I don't
yes,
disturb this peace, then there's going to be good things that flow into my life. Yeah. Okay.
right,
Which
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 is
suffering will blow
so
that
wrong.
thought
I
up more
discovered.
than anything else, right?
Yes. And so I'm just going to be totally transparent here.
Mm,
It's still difficult for me to share the story because, it's just very personal. But
mm,
so after all of this, I was at a Bible study with a bunch of people I actually didn't know. I had signed up for this working women Bible study, and should you work if you're a mom, or should you be a stay-at-home mom? And I had signed
mm,
up for it, thinking by this point, I would be 6 months pregnant, and I should know the answers to these questions. And I went to the Bible study, and that night, I just remember we were all in this room, and there was about 20 women, and we were drinking milk and eating cookies. And at the end of the um, the Bible study, the leader asked for prayer requests. And I remember like just biting my tongue and like just putting my head down in the book, like refusing to share any of the pain that I was going through with anyone.
mm,
Refusing to share about my miscarriages, refusing to share about all of these medical complications that had been discovered over the last few months, refusing to talk about my dad or my brother or my mom or any of the family situations I had. And instead, I was just listening to these prayer requests. And as they were coming in, I just got more and more angry,
Mm.
like more and more angry. Like one woman, prayed for her dog, and I'm like, okay. And then this other woman prayed for her mom's cold, and then this other woman prayed for her daughter's test. And at this point, I'm like, am I the only one in this room like that feels like they are on the brink of losing their mind?
Mm.
And I just held it all in, and I was just so angry. And it wasn't these women that I was angry at. I was just angry. And I got in my car and I turned off the car light and I just sat and breathed for about 10 minutes to try to compose myself before I could even drive. And on the drive home from that Bible study, I have never screamed at God,
Mm.
yelled at God, accused God more in my entire life. Tears were just streaming down my face, almost to the point where I couldn't even see the road. And very thankful it was not a busy a busy road. I was taking subway napkins, out of my center console and just wiping the mascara off my face and just saying things that I had been thinking in my heart, but I had refused to be honest with God about.
Mm.
And like really hard things like, why would you let this happen to me? Why would you tell me to be fruitful, multiply, and do this? Why is my family breaking apart and you aren't even letting me start a new family with my husband?
Mm.
What have I done for you to treat me like this? And it was, didn't say it like that. I was literally screaming at the top of my lungs, lost my voice and everything. And that was my breaking point. But I will never forget this. And I think this is so important for listeners to keep this in mind. I finally put down my walls and was just honest with everything that I had been feeling for the last year. And when I was done with my rant and I was done screaming and I was done crying and I kind of just sat in the car, God's peace just washed over me, like just washed over me. And I just think that was just one of the greatest gifts that He has ever given me, was just quietly letting me know that He was there regardless of how I felt. And that was definitely the turning point for me. And that's when things started to shift and
Mm.
my mind started to shift and things started to go better for me internally.
Wow.
Things did not get better externally after that,
Mm.
but internally it started to get better after that.
Yeah.
And after that turning point, um, I had another situation where I had to go back to the doctor because um, they found a calcium deposit when I went to the emergency room. And the sixth thought that I have here, so I had this breakthrough, and I've had this change in thought, and I would say the sixth thought that I had, during this time was that breakthroughs happen in God's time,
Mm.
and they can literally happen anywhere.
Mm.
And so when I went back to the doctor and got this, calcium deposit checked out, I had to go see a urologist. And she was a young doctor, and I was like, "Hey, I'm, taking a lunch break from work. Can we speed this up? I really need to go." And so we did a cystoscopy. And so once again, I'm on another, hospital bed, with a gown on, and everyone can see everything. You learn, just to deal with it after multiple losses and stuff. You're
Yeah.
just like, you can't be modest. So anyway, she was like, "Do you want to watch the camera and see what's going on in your bladder?" And I was like, "Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds really cool." So during the cystoscopy, I'm watching the camera and, watching the thing going on in my bladder. And during this, like, just quick, you know, physical exam, I see this thing in my bladder and I immediately point to it and I ask her, I say, "What is that? Like, what's going on there?" And, for the third time in the last year and a half, doctor just stops talking to me and face goes flat. And so I have learned by this point that that does not mean anything good. So I stop asking questions and I just stare up at the ceiling and just wait for her to be done and then give me whatever news she's going to give me. And when she's done, she looks at me and she says, "Traci, I'm sorry, but you have bladder cancer." She was like, "I've
Oh,
seen this
goodness.
many times, and we need to schedule a procedure to remove the tumor immediately."
Oh,
And
my goodness.
I just start laughing like a crazy woman.
Yeah.
I'm at that point where I'm just like, okay, this has got to be a joke. Like, I couldn't have thought of anything worse today happening than this happening. And, she sits me up and she's like, "Traci, I've looked at your chart. Like, I know what you've been through the last year. I know about the miscarriages. I know about all these procedures. I know about everything you've been through, and I'm really sorry." She's like, "But we have got to get this procedure scheduled as soon as possible." And so, I get dressed and I put on my clothes and I immediately call my husband and I'm like, "You've got to come to the hospital." Well, he's on an airplane flying a congressional fellowship to Louisiana because at the time he was stationed at the Pentagon. And he's literally on a flight that's taking off, so he can't be there for me. And so it was just very, very hard. And it was just one of those things where, I thought I hit rock bottom, on the way home, confessing all these things to God. And then now I'm like, okay, this is really rock bottom. Like, this is really rock bottom. And so my dad can't be there for me. My mom's not, able to be there for me. And now my husband's not there. And I'm just like, okay, I guess I'm just going to go home. And on the way home, I just get this thought like, I need greasy food to kind of help me get through today. I,
Amen.
and I'm sure most people can relate to this, right? Like, I need a little bit of greasy food.
Yes.
So I just Google search Chick-fil-A. I love Chick-fil-A. I love their number one with extra pickles and a lemonade.
Mm.
And so I just go to my nearest Chick-fil-A and it's miles from my home. Like 20 miles away from my home. So in DC terms, that's like very far
Right.
away.
Right.
And I go into this Chick-fil-A and I put on sunglasses and like, once again I'm sobbing all over the place and just kind of a wreck. And I hear my voice in line at Chick-fil-A and I'm like, no, no, like somebody else named Tracy is around here. But then I hear my voice again and I look and it's one of my good friends from Sunday school. It's her husband. And he's in line, getting Chick-fil-A. And he looks at me. He's like, "What are you doing all the way out here?"
Mm.
And because he knew I lived in Pentagon City. And I was like, "Oh, I'm just getting some lunch." And he was like, "Are you okay, Tracy?" And obviously he knew I wasn't okay. And I didn't answer. I just kind of shrugged. And he was like, my wife's in the car, and I think you should go talk to her." And so I did. I went out and I sat in the back seat of my friend's car, who just happened to randomly be at the same
Mm.
Chick-fil-A that I was at, and she prayed over me
Wow.
in the back seat of her car. She was like, "Just tell me what's going on." And this friend of mine had already suffered 4 IVF failures. She suffered the loss of her uncle, the loss of her grandmother, and the diagnosis of her mom having breast cancer, all while she was going through infertility.
Wow.
And at this point, she was, I think, 6 months pregnant with twins. And I just asked her, I said, "How do I get through this? Like, what do I do? This is a lot. This is a heavy load. It's a heavy burden. And I really don't know what to do anymore." And I remember she told me that God had to take her to a place of brokenness to find the beauty in trusting Him even before she got what she wanted, which was
Mm.
the gift of children. And it was just such an amazing conversation. And I truly believe to this day, God intervened on my way home and redirected me to my friend.
Wow.
100% believe that.
Wow.
Would never doubt that. And it blessed me so much.
Man.
And then I'd say the second miracle that happened that day that I was diagnosed with cancer is when I was outside of my apartment. I had another friend call me because, once again, I was on an airplane. Nobody knows that I've just been diagnosed with cancer. And she calls me, and she was an architect at the time working on a project close to Pentagon City. She said, Traci, can I come over? She was like, God just put it on my heart that I need to come see you.
Mm.
And so, of course, I tell her she can absolutely come over. And we go sit on my rooftop, and I let her talk. And, she just told me that she had been concerned about me and that she realized that I wasn't at church for a couple of Sundays. And she wanted to make sure that I was okay because um, she just felt like something was wrong and maybe something had happened to my baby. And so I shared with her that I had had a second miscarriage and that I had that day been diagnosed with bladder cancer. And, we both cried a little bit. We both embraced each other a little bit. And she pulled out her Bible from this big purse, which I thought was so cool. I need to carry around a big purse with a Bible in it. But she pulled that out and she said, can I read something to you? And I was like, yeah, please just read anything. And she went to the book of James
Mm.
and she just read over me the most amazing verses. Consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kind because, the testing of your faith develops perseverance. And out of the almost 12, I don't know how many chapters are in the Bible, but there's a little less than 1,200 chapters.
Mm.
That was the chapter that I read every day in college when I was
Mm.
figuring out how to handle my relationship with my alcoholic father
Wow.
and how to handle, the adultery that was going on between my parents. That is the chapter I read every day in college.
Wow.
And so no coincidence
Right.
at all that she just randomly chose that verse for me.
Wow.
And I feel like God put her there just to comfort me in that just awful, awful season of my life.
Yeah.
And so breakthroughs happen in God's time.
Yeah.
And they can literally happen anywhere, even a Chick-fil-A parking lot. And so that's what I want
Right.
the readers to know.
Oh man, that's awesome.
Or
The
the listeners to know.
Well, Chick-fil-A, of course, it's gonna. I mean, it's Christian chicken, so it's anointed. It's
Yeah.
you know that divine encounters are gonna happen at Chick-fil-A. But in all seriousness, Traci, I love that you described this breaking point moment where you finally got honest with God and you screamed at him and you yelled at him. As embarrassing as that may be for you to share, honestly, I think it's necessary. I remember coming to that same exact breaking point. And then I remember having the exact same experience that you did, where once you finally got it out, there was this peace. Scripture says the peace that passes all understanding, that guards your heart and mind in Christ Jesus, that it kind of crashes over you there. I always talk about waves of grief, right? If you let those waves of grief come out, then waves of grace will follow. But when we bottle up that grief, then we're not opening ourselves up to experience the grace that God wants to fill. So we have to empty that, we have to empty ourselves and lay that grief at his feet so he can fill us with him. And that's what I think your experience is. I want the listener to understand that your experience, my experience, while there's nothing formulaic about going through grief, it is essential and critical that we take this to the Lord and that we're honest with him, and he can handle that. He's not intimidated by it. He wants, he already knows what we're thinking. So it's like he's going, oh, child, I finally want you to be honest with yourself and honest with me about this, that this is not a transactional thing. This is a relationship.
Right.
And it's like, oh, finally you're ready now for me to impart these truths, the mysteries of myself into your heart. And this is what ultimately is going to heal you. So I love that you had this breaking point, and then following that breaking point, you experience this peace. And then God doesn't show up and in a cloud with a booming voice and start to tell you direction. He shows up through other people. And he gives you encouragement and comfort and hope through other people. And I'm like, man, every time I listen to stories, Traci, of people walking through suffering, this inevitably is what they're sharing. It's amazing. And so I love seeing those kinds of threads through people's stories that, and again, with you sharing that, it confirms to me, oh my gosh, this is how God works. Oh my gosh, this is how God works. It's so cool.
Absolutely. And also, even after the breaking point where you do get that peace, it doesn't mean everything's going to be perfect
That's right.
after. I got my cancer diagnosis after that.
After.
And isn't that amazing that God can give us peace even if our trials don't stop?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And
Wow.
so, yeah, I'll say the seventh point or the seventh thought that I would like to leave the listeners with is that outcomes are not the focus,
Mm.
but trusting God, that's the focus. And that's what I learned because um, I don't think the listeners need to hear the outcome of my story
Mm.
because it doesn't matter.
Right.
Because the true outcome of my story is that I found peace with God
Yeah.
and I found a way to trust God through the storm and to lean on Him when I was broken and to just trust in Him. And there's one part of my book that I wanted to read, and it's I thought God showed His love to His children by removing hardships.
Mm.
And it has taken 2 miscarriages and a cancer diagnosis to realize His sufficient supply of grace brought me to a fast food parking lot and my rooftop to be comforted by 2 dear friends. This sudden discovery of God's love is the breakthrough I've always needed but never knew I was missing.
Wow.
And that's what matters. And I know there are listeners that are struggling with infertility that might never have
Right.
the opportunity to give birth to a baby. There are listeners who might have had 1 miscarriage, but they might have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. I don't know. We don't know. God knows. And that I just think of all the women who have gone through these really difficult experiences. I think of my girlfriend who had a stillbirth just weeks before she was supposed to give birth. I think about my girlfriend who had an ectopic pregnancy and worried that, she'd have to have a fallopian tube removed.
Mm.
I mean, there are women everywhere, every day going through this, and I don't want to sit here and say it's all going to be, roses
Right.
and sunflowers and whatever moving forward. I can't promise that, but what I can promise is that God is there,
Yeah.
and there are breakthroughs, and that's what matters.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I wanted to leave it with the listener.
Mm. Wow. That's so good. You're right. All of our stories are continually in progress and in process.
Yeah,
And so it's not about the outcome. That's often what
right.
we're going to God for. We want an outcome or a result. And God knows that what we really need is a relationship. You know, what we really need is the only thing that can satisfy our soul, and that is Him. And that is that peace that is not necessarily going to change the storm. The storm might still be happening, but it's peace in the midst of the storm, right? And I'm so glad that you said that because, I mean, even Scripture talks about how there are so many who, they it talks about the men and women of faith who died with the hope of a promise that they never saw fulfilled on this side of eternity, right? And that was credited to them as righteousness. And that's the reality of our human experience here in this fallen world, is that we may have those things in our life, but that doesn't detract from how good God is and the richness that we can experience in spite of not having what we desire or having something that we never would have asked for. You've experienced both of those.
Yeah.
You've experienced both of those situations, just like Elizabeth Elliot was saying in that quote we talked about earlier, you've experienced the reality of having something that you never asked for and not having what you truly desire. And it's very neat to see your perspective as you look back on those things. I'm curious about a couple things, before we kind of close our time here. I want to draw back from the conversation you had with your friend at the very beginning, where she has this miscarriage in the middle of this. It was a church function. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
So I found it kind of striking, just as you did. Not only that she apologized in that moment, right? I'm so sorry, I should have never come, right? That, I mean, geez, what a tender heart right there, that she's experiencing this just excruciating loss, and yet she's concerned about how this might have affected you. But also, she's in a community that should be the community that you would want something like this to happen, right? They could really walk
Yeah.
with you through this, even in the moment, right? This just horrible thing. They can walk with you in this. And yet she's feeling a struggle to be received in that, right? For whatever
Mm.
reason. And I think a lot of it is because this is something, there's kind of a veil of silence surrounding this issue a lot of times, miscarriage and infertility.
Yes.
And you would know better than I would, because these are things that I'm sure you're talking about in circles with your girlfriends. And can you explain that a little bit? Can you talk about that? Maybe shed some light for everybody on what it feels like, even in church circles, to feel like you're walking around on tiptoe on eggshells as this topic is coming up, and why is that the case, and what can we do about it?
Yeah. That is such a good question. And it's, jam packed with a bunch of different layers, I think. You know, I'll start with the point where I had my first miscarriage and I was home alone. I was not going out. I wasn't very hungry. I wasn't hanging out with my friends. And I got a call from Angela, my friend.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and she was like, Adam told me what happened. Your husband told me what happened. And I just want to say that um, I wouldn't wish this upon anyone, and that nobody understands what it's like until they go through it. And I'm so sorry that you've had to go through this too. We had a moment where we cried together on the phone, and there was just this unique bond that we had because there was just this life experience that we had now both had
Right.
that is kind of unexplainable. And it really helped me to be able to walk alongside a friend in those moments. But looking back, I didn't reach out to her.
Mm.
And I knew she had had a miscarriage. And I don't think I did it intentionally, but that's how I reacted. Like my personal reaction was almost just to hunker down and hide and not talk about it and isolate myself.
Mm.
And this is one of my best friends. And so I think something we might need to think about in the church community is, you know, oftentimes a woman's natural reaction is just to go isolate herself.
Mm.
That's not all women's, choice, but I think that can be a natural choice for women to just be like, I don't want to talk about it, and I don't want anyone to know, and I don't, want to share this because it's so intimate.
Yeah.
And so I think what the church could do, and I do think there are many churches that do a really good job with this, is being available when a woman is ready to talk about it, or having programs where, you can talk about what is IVF and what are your beliefs around that, and what is a miscarriage, and have you experienced one, and here are some support groups. I have also read a number of different infertility Bible studies
Mm.
that I think are really great. But it's just such a hard question to answer. Like what should the church do in these situations? Because every woman's experience is unique,
Yeah.
and so I think what I would say to that is maybe not what the church can do, but what can women
Mm.
within the church who know people who are going through this, what can they do as like a direct support system for these these women?
That's good.
And that's kind of where I've found myself. If I hear about a woman who's had a miscarriage or
Yeah.
suffered some type of pregnancy loss, or is going through infertility, um, I'll just write them a really nice card
Mm.
and say, I've experienced two miscarriages. It broke my heart. Just know that I'm praying for you. And if you ever want someone to talk to, you can call me.
Mm.
And just little bitty gestures like that, I think just go a long way. Because some women, wherever they are in their journey, they might not be ready to talk.
Yeah.
They might not be ready to share. Or they might not even want to share it with you. They might only want to share it with their mom or, with a coworker. But not forcing the conversation, but just opening the door and letting them know I am available. I'm here to support you if you want that support. I think that is just so important
Yeah.
for women to receive that, and it's just really difficult. It's really difficult to start that conversation. It can be very uncomfortable, but I would think women would be thankful
Yeah.
just to know there are women thinking about them out there.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Um, the last question I have, Tracy, is we alluded to this earlier, but oftentimes in our suffering, in our circumstances, there are not only the internal wrestlings that the emotions and the grief and the anger and the jealousy, as you talked about, all these different emotions that we're wrestling through and trying to work through, sort out. There's also external factors that can really complicate our suffering. And one of those for you is being in a military community. It can also, some of these, it's a not common situation of a community to be in. And I don't know a whole lot about military community, although we do work with some folks even in our ministry that they're in military communities, and it's just so transient, and so it's difficult to find just really, really good, solid. Often you just feel isolated in a lot of instances, or
Yeah.
you start to get close to somebody, and then they're reassigned or deployed, or And so, can you talk a little bit about that? And I know some of your journey has taken place while you guys are overseas, and some of it has been while you've been uh, uh, you know living near or on a base, and that those kinds of things that can complicate the matters in terms of your community. It's so important to have good, strong community around you as you're healing. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I would definitely agree that being an active duty military spouse, or a spouse of anybody in the military that has very unique hours and responsibilities, it definitely adds a layer of complication to infertility, which is already very
Right.
complicated. Um, it's not consistent across the board
Mm-hmm.
in the military, and that's why it's so hard. And what I mean by that is the hospitals and what services they provide are not consistent
Mm-hmm.
across the country. You could be stationed somewhere that provides IVF treatments, but then you PCS somewhere that doesn't.
Oh
You
wow.
could be stationed somewhere where there's genetic counselors who tell you what balanced Robertsonian translocation is, and give you resources and information that you can utilize as you try to expand your family. But then there might not be a genetics counselor at the next duty station you have. There's separation issues. You know, women who are going through IUIs or IVFs, they have a very, very specific calendar that they have to abide by,
Right.
and it's pretty regimented. And if he's not there when it's time, he's not there, and that is literally money down the
Yeah.
drain.
Oh
Whether
yeah.
it be a training exercise the spouse has to go to, or a deployment, and having to put your entire trying on hold for an entire year. I mean, all of those things can absolutely happen to military families, and I think is very challenging. And if I am not mistaken, I do not believe IVF is covered through our healthcare
Mm.
at this point. I know there's been a lot of push for that to be covered. Don't think that's happened yet. So you also have to know what resources are available to you and what is covered by your insurance and what isn't. And that's something that I think can be hard to navigate
Right.
for military families as well. Those are questions that are always ones that are asked in those doctor's appointments. Those are just a few things
Yeah.
that people go through. And then, there's a whole nother side to being a military spouse that's more of I'd say an emotional thing.
Yeah.
You're not around your family. You live miles away from your friends. You might have just moved into a house and you haven't even unpacked yet because you might be
Right.
moving 4 months later. And so there's definitely like a layer, an extra layer of
Mm.
isolation that can happen. And I just, for any military spouse that might be listening to this podcast going through infertility, just really, really would encourage you to find a church home
Mm.
that has a program where there are women struggling with this same situation as you, and get into a Bible study
Yeah.
and get that support that you need. Maybe even ask your mom or your dad to fly out and help you out for a week or two if you can. I mean, I know everyone's situation is different, but the isolation component is very, very real,
Right.
and would just really caution women to do their best to be transparent and vulnerable. And that is so hard. And I'd even go as far to say it's not fair,
Mm.
but in being transparent and in being vulnerable, it allows other women the opportunity to come up to you and say, I'm going through that too.
Mm.
Or I've been
Great.
through that before. I'd love to support you.
Yeah.
And that really opens the door up for, conversation and relationships.
Mm.
So,
That's so good. I think it's very important to note that often we don't want to be vulnerable and expose some of those parts of our life and of our heart that it's terrifying. When you put yourself out there like that, it's terrifying because there's always this thought in the back of your mind, I must be the only one that's going through this. And I think that
hmm
is an absolute strategy and ploy of the enemy to isolate us even further.
oh, yeah.
And what I've found more often than not is when you finally do say, you kind of step forward and go, hey, this is what I'm dealing with, that people come out of the woodwork and they're like, hey, I am too. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad somebody said something about this because I've been dealing with this
Yeah.
for a long time. And then what a ripe opportunity for ministry right there and community and walking through it together. And so I'm so glad you said that, Traci. I think that's imperative. And Traci, this has been an incredible conversation. I know that I want to make sure everybody is pointed in the direction of your most recent book where you chronicle a lot of this stuff, My Miscarriage and Other Uninvited Events. We'll make sure that we put that on the show notes. But, I know that they're going to get a deeper dive into some of the stuff that we've talked about and a little bit more insight into your journey in that book. And so it's just, I appreciate you being honest and raw with not only your writing, but also your time with us right now, because I know that it does exactly what we just talked about. It allows other people to feel the safety and the space to say, hey, me too. Me too. I'm walking
hmm
in that same direction, in that same journey. Traci, where can our listeners follow you more and just kind of jump along on your journey?
Yeah. Thanks, Davey. That's really sweet. If listeners are interested in learning more about my story, they can visit my website, which is tracimccombs.com. My book is available on Amazon, and if you type in my miscarriage, it'll pop up. But yeah, just Davey, thank you so much for this time. I think Nothing is Wasted does a fabulous job, and I really hope any woman or any family that's going through infertility that they gain some hope from
Yeah,
listening to this podcast.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Traci. It's an honor to be able to discuss this with you. Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.